Thank you so much for joining me today. We finally get to speak, Benjamin.
We do. You're Canadian, so hopefully you'll know this reference from Anna Avonlea when she meets Catherine Brooke, and she says, "Glad you spell your name with a K. A C always looks so smug."
I am Catherine with a
Yeah.
K. I really
Oh,
wanted to do a version of Liza with a Z, not
yeah.
Liza with a Z.
Yeah.
I wanted to do a version of that. It's Catherine with a K, not
Yeah.
Catherine with a C. Yeah,
Yeah.
one day I'll record it.
Yeah.
But it's been, we connected on that platform called now X,
Yeah.
and the funny thing is we almost didn't get to talk to each other because for some reason Benjamin had me blocked,
I don't know. I
and
don't
I
know
didn't
why.
know. And I was
Yeah.
like, I couldn't figure out because I assumed because you did, and you show up in my feed,
Yeah.
so I noticed it because of that, and so I was like, I wonder, like, is he just really like judgmental, or did I say, was it
Right.
because I advocated? Like, so I had all these different things in my head. And then I think one of my followers, like, oh, maybe you should unblock Catherine. And you did. And then you're
Yeah.
like,
She was sort of
you
pleading
don't know
my
why.
case, like, "Oh, he's really," and I was just like, "I actually don't know why I blocked you," but I I used to be pretty reluctant to do it, but I've gotten very block happy in
I
recent
can
times where I'm
understand
just like,
that.
used to be, "Oh, I was standing on principle," "It's so bad for journalists to block people. What kind of precedent does that set?" I'm like, "Those people are annoying. They're driving me crazy. I never want to hear from them again." So we're in the latter category, especially the last 2 months.
Yeah, but I'm really glad that in the end we
Yeah.
connected because actually we have great
Yeah, we
conversations,
do.
and I think for me the block button was also something that I was like, I'm never blocking. I don't, I really didn't believe in it, and then gradually I've like absolutely changed my mind on that. So I will never block somebody for an opposing opinion,
Mhm.
right? But it has to be delivered with a level of decorum, right? It
Mhm.
can't be like an insult. You're the C word or whatever.
Yeah.
And then they're, well argued. Usually it's not well argued at all.
Yeah.
It's just too much. I think some people argue with me about, well, it's freedom of speech. I'm like, yeah, but I do have the freedom of not wanting to
Yeah.
associate. Like if you walked up to me on the street and you started swearing at me and attacking me, like even with your words, like who's in the right mind is going to like want to engage with that?
Like,
And when
there's
that
no
happens to you,
constitution of my ex account. I'm sorry. Like, I'm gonna block
no.
you.
And when that happens, like, how many times a day, or, you post one thing and it's just like nonstop, it's like, okay,
Hmm.
well, this person, if they can't engage using actual language and they can very welcome to express their opposing view.
Hmm.
But if you are attacking
Yeah.
me, like calling me names, now I'm like, sometimes I give people a few strikes, but sometimes just lately I've become a little bit more trigger happy. And
Yeah.
people tell me I'm not trigger happy enough, honestly.
I generally think that people under 500 followers who have an avatar of a cat or a cartoon of a cat who just say one very short sentence about how they don't care if people are dying of AIDS in Africa, that I don't need to hear from them.
No, and I have a tendency to agree with that because, yeah, that just kind of tells me they haven't shown me that they can engage in a way that's productive in
Or they're
any
bots.
kind of discourse. Yeah. Well, I wonder, are they bots or are they real people who are like that? Because I think there are real people like that, and that's
No, no.
just, and
Just,
they won't do it in person. Like
oh
the
no.
way that people behave online, the way they behave in person is significantly different.
Yeah.
But here we
Well,
are in a very digital
yeah.
age.
I did almost have a fist fight between a very heterodox friend and someone I would describe as more progressive at my election night gathering. So one of them
Mhm.
instructed me never to have the other person there again if he was going to be in the room. So I
Well,
never.
and I think no, and I think with you, what's sort of interesting is that you are, you're threading that needle, or if that's the right expression,
Mhm.
between I think. Definitely some the progressive world, mainstream media, also some heterodox kinds of thinkers, and in a discourse that I think has become I was going to say sick, but I don't know if that's the best phrasing, but certainly damaged, specifically science and health in particular.
Mhm.
Certainly, the pandemic has played a role in how everything is so polarized and sensationalized, but I think it has been going on probably for a while. How do you, I mean, can you maybe give a little bit of background on your journalism work
Yeah.
and how you approach it?
So I live in here in New York City. I've been here since I started at Columbia in 1997. So I just decided when I was an undergrad to become a journalist and set out to do it. I wrote about HIV for many, many years as my main specialty. I'd started doing volunteer work about that when I was a teenager in Seattle. And that has ultimately morphed into being a more broad-based science reporter. So yeah, I covered some of COVID, mostly focusing on treatments like monoclonal antibodies and Paxlovid and that sort of thing, and did this crash course in monkeypox the summer of 2022, which happened to correspond with my having cancer. So at the very same time that like I'm getting very sick from chemotherapy, monkeypox is following the same trajectory. So that was a very strange summer, but it in a way sort of put me on the map, so to speak, where I had this career of training and not only how to analyze studies and to look at epidemiology and that sort of thing in the context of gay men having sex with one another, but knowing how all the major players were going to play the game and they were going to worry too much about stigma and prioritize that over being honest about, the way that viruses transmit between gay men who have multiple sex partners. So I handled that study the very first week I was navigating chemo brain, and so my
Mm.
brain was just all over the place, and I was so proud of myself that I even handed in the story at all. And then my editor said, like, you didn't do the assignment correctly, and I had to do it over.
Oh,
But
gosh.
I remember looking at that moment. I was like, "That does it. I quit. I can't work all summer." And she nicely helped me fix it. And then I worked the whole summer. But I remember just looking at what was in front of me with monkeypox and saying, "Oh, I get this. This is a gay thing, and no one wants to say it. Yeah, I know this game." And sure enough, it was
Mhm.
the rest of the summer. So sometimes people ask me, like, what is it about you that, that you have this capacity for pushing against the grain, being heterodox in your thinking or whatever it might be. I don't really have the answer to that, but I think at the baseline, it's just like doing your homework. And what I always say, there's certain people in this sort of podcast space who might remain nameless, or I might name them later, who don't do the reading before they come to class, I always say. And if you do the reading and you can understand it, and you can often understand when the quote unquote experts aren't being forthright with you, then you can do a better job than them explaining what's going on, et cetera.
Well, that sort of leads to my next question, which is because that is a much more specialized area, right? Like, I think a lot of writing, people might think they can just sort of pick it up and do it. But I think, in particular, health requires a lot more
Mhm.
understanding.
Yeah.
So you're going to be able to read research, you're going to have to understand how the body
Mhm.
works. How do you approach like that part of it to really understand it so it's not
Yeah.
just coming from, some kind of a
Yeah.
spokesperson?
Um, I guess again, just doing the reading slavishly over and over and over again. It was 2012, and I had been writing about HIV more from like a socio-cultural lens since college. And Pause Magazine, this magazine for people with HIV, they offered me the science role. Said, you want to be our science writer? You'll cover all the research coming out. And my response was like, gee, I'm not really that much of a science writer per se. I've done some, but they're just like, oh, you'll be fine. Here are some tips. Like, here's what an odds ratio is. Here's what a hazard ratio is. And that's what I name my Substack. It's my friend's idea. But aside from sort of the basic tricks of sort of, what a confidence interval is and what p hacking is and the p value and all these things about to do with statistics, just the sheer volume of reading paper after paper after paper and talking to researchers all the time. And there's on one hand maintaining a lot of humility that they are the experts per se, but when you've been in it a long enough time, you can start to step back a bit and realize when they're not being necessarily as honest or forthright. So, for example, when the HIV prevention pill came out in 2012, the first really 5 or 6 years of its lifespan on the market, all of the experts in the HIV world were determined to deny that anyone was taking this drug for the purpose of using condoms less or not at all, and that they were engaging what's known as risk compensation. So an example of that is if you use SPF 30 on your body and you stay out in the sun 5 times longer, and you actually increase your risk of skin cancer. So this was a concern, if not necessarily for increasing the risk of HIV, because these drugs are extremely effective at preventing HIV, then for other sexually transmitted infections. And so it was amazing to watch all of these intelligent people who had posts at major universities, and they were highly decorated and had many advanced degrees and so on, so forth, telling me something that was so flat out obviously incorrect. If they had ever really just asked anyone, or ever been on a hookup app in the gay world, that yes, people were taking this drug so that they could have sex without a condom, and that even though condom use was declining over time and had been since the advent of HIV treatment in the mid-90s, this hastened the decline. And you hear terms like, they would speak of it in binary terms, either you do or you don't. And that's one thing I notice a lot, especially, and also with monkeypox, people would say things like, and it's already starting to be seen amongst children. And there's expressions like that, and there's qualitative expressions that send the incorrect message. Like, no, it wasn't a matter of whether gays either didn't or did and now don't use condoms. It was on a decline, and did it speed it up? Hopefully we all took pre-calculus, right? We know about rates and rates of change, etc. So I was able to observe these people, for whom I had a considerable amount of respect, behave somewhat dishonorably for the goal of maintaining the brand. And that's the thing that happened with monkeypox. They were worried about like the gay brand. We didn't want to make gays look bad, because then bad things could happen to gays, and we don't want to make them mad. And so that was troubling to me just on its face for intellectual honesty. And then when I would get pressure for that and other things, where I would be unwilling to publish something that I knew that wasn't true, and I get pressure from activists, I would always find it amazing. And I'm seeing this now as well as in the pediatric gender medicine world that I cover, where people would be confounded that I'm making things difficult for the activists, and the advocates. And they look at me with a straight face, and you're like, you're not making it easy for us to go out there and advocate for our cause. And I'm like, you are presuming that I am one of you. Your job is to spin. My job is just to tell whatever is true. And one has to be sort of agnostic. You need to do as good a job as possible, and not use inflammatory language and all those things to be responsible about the way you.
But now we have a situation where a lot of journalists, so they're not so mistaken, because more often than not, the journalists are kind of on their side. I found that too when I was writing about certain things. And in reality, I would say I was just neutral about the things. Like I approach things with more curiosity, especially if I'm interviewing someone. I don't necessarily always have like some kind of a stance. Especially in the article, like I might even have a stance, but you won't really see it because I'm just curious. I want to know what their opinion is. But I think a lot of times I've been met with an attitude that's sort of like, there is an expectation that you agree and that you're helping promote the activists. Even when I get pitches about, like I've written about a lot of environmental related stories. And I'm definitely not writing it as an activist, but I think they're interesting initiatives. So I think they deserve some light. But I think the way that even like in pitches that I'm approached about it, it's like, you're going to want to promote our cause. Right. And I don't think that's the role of a journalist. But I think there's where I'm sort of really curious, because you maintained, I think, a presence in pretty mainstream journalism. And I'm curious as to, did you have pressure from editors? How open were they to somebody who's just taking a...
Well... so one of the other things that happened, so I was at Pause from 2012 to 2020, and summer of 2018, these activists, which were sort of third generation ACT UP activists, and they're kind of looking to make their name in this whole world. And they came out with this claim that the primary reason for reduced or limited uptake of the HIV prevention pill PrEP amongst gay men was because of the high list price of the drug, which was called Truvada. And at the time it was, something like $2,000 a month. And I had read all the research, like literally all of it about this. And I'd written hundreds of articles on the subject, and I confronted them and I showed them how their white paper was totally incorrect and there was not at all supported by evidence. And then they threw a fit, and one of them published like a blog post slamming me with pause, even though it didn't name me, but like they let him publish it. And there was another thing where it took a very long time for researchers to prove that effectively treating HIV and fully suppressing it with antiretrovirals eliminates the risk of sexual transmission. And before this, there was enough accumulated data to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt this was absolutely true. I refused to say so, but there was an activist group that was determined to make me do it. And so these two things, and we would lock horns, and those two things, those activist groups would complain about me. And ultimately I was told by my bosses that if you antagonize and upset the activists one more time, we're going to fire you. And they put a moratorium on my covering prep, which was like my most prized specialty. And I was devastated, in part because of my loss of respect for my boss. And, I just felt like, I'm sorry, I guess we really are writing text to accompany pharmaceutical ads at this place. And all you really care about is going home at 6 and keeping your job. And that's fine. I mean, if that's what you want to do, but this is, we certainly have our cross purposes here. So I reluctantly stayed there for financial reasons until I could finally leave. So yes, I have had that kind of pressure. But you see it's just the way that editors kind of will tweak language and take out, like, you really scored a really good point that, somewhere about some malfeasance by, a country or a group of people. And they don't really want to take the risk on just you as a freelancer coming in and dropping a big bomb. So that can be frustrating, but
This is where I found, like, I've never had editors like literally say, oh, we don't want to cover this because of your perspective or whatnot, or because of the topic. It's usually more like, yeah, we're going to pass, or silence. Like, there was one story I honestly, I just shopped it around because I wanted to see what the response would be. I had a feeling what it would be, although it was worse than I expected. So as somebody who pitches, who's pitched a lot, has been published a lot, at the very least, I get a polite no thank you. But in this case, it was like
nothing.
Size. It was a text related story, and it was like just not a single response, right? And because it was an anomaly, that was actually saying something. And it just, I think that fear also, and I don't even think it's always necessarily because everybody just disagrees with you. I think they're afraid of taking that risk. And I mean, in some cases, it's a certain kind of like fear, or maybe they do have a very strong belief and they're not willing to entertain anything else. On the other hand, I think a lot of it is just like a certain fear and compliance. And it's the same thing I would say with, consensus culture, right? So you have that in journalism, but you also have that to some extent in science. And I don't want to say that it's certainly not always wrong. There's a reason why there is consensus on certain topics, but it's sometimes hard to know whether the consensus is real because of scientific expertise, or is it real because people are afraid of dissenting, or these publications, these journals are not going to publish something that doesn't align. Or it's because, certain research the pharmaceutical companies are paying money for, and other research, you don't have funding. So there's all these different elements. How do you discern that yourself? Like, why is there a consensus?
Well, I started getting interested in pediatric gender medicine toward the end of 2022 after the monkeypox summer ended, and I was looking for new ideas. And for one thing, I saw how badly certain reporters like Jesse Singal were being treated, or, reporters in the New York Times were being treated by activists. And, it just really seemed like there was smoke, there was fire, and they wouldn't be so underhanded in their treatment of these, what I perceive to be very fine journalists, if they had a hand to play, essentially. So I just started reading about it obsessively. And you find the odd person who's like, yes, this happened to me too. And I went down the rabbit hole. And once you see it, you can't unsee it, and found, some similarities in the way that groupthink establishes itself within an academy. And you never want to buck that trend. One thing I noticed is that, like, terms like Latinx, they sweep through the public health field within 12 months. Everyone will start saying it. If the switch from, and I actually prefer that, injection drug user to person who inject drugs, person person first languages. That happened, overnight practically. So there's a lot of groupthink. People really want to seem like they're part of the gang in this world. So I saw a lot of similarities to the HIV world and the public health world in the pediatric gender medicine. But I had essentially, you will hear one paper from people who are highly decorated and very well respected in their field, and they say one thing about gender medicine, and then someone with the exact same types of qualifications says exactly the opposite. And that's very difficult because you are yourself, myself, not a researcher in this field. So I have to have read enough to start noticing, even when you read one sentence, oh, that's an out there statement. I bet you it's the citation. Let's check. Yep, it's Florence Ashley. You know who Florence Ashley is. You know that she's somewhat of what call it a shit poster in her academic work. So you start to see when people are being dishonest with the public. Jack Turpin, who's a child and adolescent psychiatrist at UCSF, and he was previously at Stanford and Harvard Medical School. Last year in June, 3 things happened. He published a book in which he said in 3 different parts of the book that he suggested that the assessments before a child receives gender transition treatments were worthless and it should be done away with, essentially, that they were counterproductive. That very same month, he published an op-ed in the New York Times in which he said to the public, don't worry, I'm going to assuage your fears. Like, we're doing these assessments, we're taking good care of these kids, we're being really cautious. And that same month, he published a paper in, I think it was a Journal of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, with Diane Aronsaf, the godmother of this movement, also at UCSF, in which they described how to conduct these assessments. And the very first bullet point is that these assessments were not to determine if a child were truly trans. And they put it in scare quotes. To even ask it was absurd. And so a single person said all of these things in a single month in 3 different formats. And I just want to say to him, like, you think that people aren't paying attention? Well, actually, most of them aren't. But actually, I am. I read all this stuff, and I'm going to call you out on it. And this really makes me wonder about everything that you say. So when you see somebody who's behaving like that in their discourse, and you know that they are one of the leading members of this field, despite being rather young, and despite other people in their field finding him rather obnoxious, as they told me, that it really makes you wonder about the rest of this field, of all the other people who agree with him and publish similar things. So it just, to your point earlier, I started shopping around pitches in early 2023 and went from place to place within the liberal media. And these people largely told me things, but they told me things only in certain words. So they'd say things like, I just don't have the institutional bandwidth for this right now. That quote I took to mean a barely veiled admission that I am afraid of my younger staffers. We have seen in this place and elsewhere what has happened with quote unquote woke staffers and what they can do. They can drive me out of a job. And I would like to keep my home and just be able to support my family. Another person said, like, I don't want the GLAAD truck. So GLAAD, the LGBTQ media watchdog organization, drove this truck around the New York Times in the February of 2023 and again a year later, claiming that the science is settled and that New York Times was evil and its publication of articles about pediatric gender medicine that I think were fantastic and that were very well balanced. Criticize people like Emily Bazelon and Nazim Qureshi, who I think are fantastic reporters. People are afraid of this truck. That truck was very successful. I think it set back like a true advance in the liberal media of covering this subject properly by at least a year or two, at least from what I've seen. It's now been 2 years since that happened. So, I had editors say that I'm afraid of that truck. I'm afraid of it going around our building. I'm afraid of getting fired. And so ultimately I gave up and I started writing for conservative outlets. And I write with editors that I've worked before, that I know, and that I can slap upside the head if I want to and say, like, don't put any more hyperbolic terms in my piece. I'm trying to be as neutral as possible here. With what I'm reporting about the subject. So
it's very frustrating because none of these issues should really be political issues, and they've become political issues. It's like, okay, if you believe this particular thing about this topic, you're automatically put on the conservative side or the liberal side, and that's not necessarily true. I think it's a very complex topic. It's one that I was actually super afraid to talk about. Of all topics, that was probably it. It's not a topic that figures prominently in my mind, but so I don't talk about it that much. But I have talked about it since, and I have my views, and I also have my confusions. Like I
Yeah.
don't know honestly, and I
Well,
think that's a
we don't. That's the point of it all, is that the research is largely inconclusive according to all the systematic literature reviews.
I think the problem is that you have something where there is a lot of uncertainty.
Mhm.
Okay. And people have put their ideologies on top of
Mhm.
it, the various ideologies. And, I don't know if you've seen, you wrote a piece recently where you basically said, you would use pronouns for
Mhm.
people
Yeah.
because it's the nice thing to do.
Yeah.
And I had commented saying, that's what I do. And in fact, I think it takes more effort to look at somebody who presents looking female and
I would argue.
intentionally call them male.
Yeah.
Um, and I do think it's kind of jerky behavior, frankly.
Yeah.
But I immediately had a bunch of people upset with me because just because I would use somebody's pronoun, and the feminists got mad, and then you've got this is the kind of the state of the discourse with this is that you are either supporting childhood transition
Mhm.
and you're evil and you're erasing women, or on the other side you are a transphobe, you hate trans
Mhm.
people, and you're not, if you don't immediately affirm everything and look at other things, when in reality there's a lot of people who just want the best for people, and we have disagreements on what that is or what that looks like. And we have this climate in which it's almost impossible, because I think it's so important for people to be talking to each other. I've had Brianna Wu on
Mhm.
with Christina Buttons,
Mhm.
and we were talking about childhood transition and I and some other aspects of it, and they had different opinions.
Yeah, they really
And
do.
I think, yeah, and I think it's really important to express those opinions and
Yeah.
have the push and pull so you can really explore the issue. It crystallized to me actually as kind of the moderator of that was like, well, okay, Christina, from her perspective, she wants to protect kids who might not actually be trans from making
Right.
a decision that's going to affect their lives. Very
Mhm.
valid.
Yeah.
And from Brianna's point of view, she wants to protect the kids
Mhm.
who are trans, who, if they are not able to transition, are going to have a much more difficult life going forward, and the hardships of going through puberty and
Yeah.
everything, and having this be part of their condition.
Mhm.
And so that's also, I think, a valid stance.
Yeah.
And so I don't think there's that clear, and I understand people will arrive on one side or another of it, but in reality, like, it's a complex issue, and it's
Yeah.
become impossible to talk about in a way that's productive, in a
Mhm.
way that doesn't vilify
Mhm.
somebody's thinking about it. And I think it's very, if ultimately what we want to do is protect people and give them the best possibility at life, we're not doing that
Yeah.
by making it stigmatized, by making it politicized. One thing that I noticed in your writing about this topic in particular, is that you use kind of neutral language. Like
Yeah.
you really pay a lot of attention
Yes.
to the words that you use.
Yes, I
Can you
do.
talk a little bit about that and maybe give us
Yeah.
some examples?
Yeah. So, for example, well, there's the term trans-identified child is considered a slur by trans activists and their allies. My general take on children is that the ethics of treating children with puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones is very different than treating adults with cross-sex hormones. So you have to take that in consideration, that the whole purpose of adolescence is identity formation. So to take it sort of one step removed and say, instead of a transgender child, which sort of validates their identity as a transgender person to the core of their being, and saying it's just just stressing the identity, is, to me, that's okay as a hopefully somewhat neutral reporter, because the whole point is, there was great disagreement about whether, and this is substantive disagreement. This isn't just happening over here on the polarities. This is in the middle of a global argument between experts across many different countries and different domains about whether you can trust that 11-year-old kid going into a clinic truly knows that they quote unquote are trans. And I don't really want to get into the debates of whether there is such a thing as being trans, et cetera. And to that, I say to people, you know, if people identify as trans, therefore transgender identity exists, and they lose their mind because they think I'm saying that you can change your sex, but like you're not listening to me. So
Hmm.
that's one term. Whereas I wouldn't so much use trans identified adult, because I think with adults we can be more confident that their identity has formed solidly. There are exceptions, of course. The term gender affirming care I am a great opponent of, because it comes with baked in the presumption that they are affirming the correct gender. There are terms like this that were created by nonprofit groups, perhaps by people at GLAAD, I don't know where, to push a political point. I remember it was 2004, and I was interviewing Evan Wolfson, who was the head of Freedom to Marry, which was this advocacy group that was fighting for same-sex marriage. And I called it gay marriage or something. I think I called it gay marriage over the phone with him. And he got really mad, and he said, you got to call it marriage equality. And the time
Hmm.
I couldn't stand up to that kind of bullying that I could now. I saw him actually not too long ago, and he was perfectly nice. But although I didn't bring up this point. But I wish I'd said to him, I would have said, Evan, that's your job. You're an activist. By calling it marriage equality, I'm coming down on a side that even as a gay person, I don't think it's my place as a journalist to do. So there are terms like that. It's very important for me to calling it gender transition treatment or gender transition intervention. There are some, like Colin Wright, who's Christina Button's boyfriend, who's an evolutionary biologist, or Leo Sapir at the Manhattan Institute, they'll call it sex trait modification surgeries or interventions. And to me, the sound of that, while very accurate, there's just a ring to it that I think is going to turn off certain people. And while, sometimes I'm perfectly happy to infuriate and alienate certain people who are in the far end of the polarities, I do want to appeal to sort of the normies in the middle with my reporting. So, all of that is very intentional. And I'm willing to take the hits if people are mad on either end of the scale. This past week, I've had this, what I think to be frankly ridiculous argument with the gender criticals and the TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, who they say, so my position is, if you've ever read a newspaper or a magazine article or watched a TV show about Caitlyn Jenner or Laverne Cox, they are referred to as transgender women. Therefore, a trans woman is a natal male or a biological male. Oh, and also there are people who don't like that. On either side of the equation, they don't like that you put a qualifier there, biological,
Yeah.
because the gender criticals say there should be no qualifiers. There's only men and women. And then the trans activists say the fact that you have to say biological sex undermines our cause of essentially changing sex. Veronica Ivy, that this trans cyclist, went on Trevor Noah a couple years ago and said, I am a biological woman. And I'm just like, no, you're not. And if we can't discuss these things scientifically with neutral, shared language, we're lost here. We'll never reach any kind of a consensus. So that just drives me insane. So the gender criticals say that a transgender woman is not a natal male who identifies as female, but the opposite. And I'm like, no, it isn't. I mean, like, you can look this up at the dictionary. You can read any mainstream outlet. They all use these terms. Okay, you're going to argue that they're all captured, but if we can't use shared terms, we are lost. So I have a few other thoughts to share about other things you were saying earlier, about if you want to sort of back and forth with the
Well, I'm
language.
curious actually, because one
Yeah.
thing you said is that you didn't have the capacity, I guess, to stand up in the past,
Yeah,
and
well, I was
now
in my
it's
mid-20s, so,
is that a just a function of aging, or is it a
yeah.
function of practice?
A little of both. Because I always look back at that and I wish I'd said something to him. And I wish I hadn't
Mm.
capitulated. Because I've learned that lesson over time, that like, no, my word choice is very deliberate. I'm not cavalier about any of this, and I'm sweating bullets over all of it. To the point where there's one editor, she assigned me something. She's like, quick, you have to do this in 5 hours, and no more haggling over word choice this time. We don't have time. And we still were at the end of the day. And I was a little intimidated by her. And I said, if we use your headline, it'll sound like this is a causal relationship between X and Y, and people will be upset about that. The experts will get mad. So I tried to take it off me because I was a little afraid of her. But I'm not going to have something go out and get published that has my name on it that I know is wrong. So yeah.
I really respect that.
Yeah.
I remember very early on getting published in a big publication for me at the time,
Mhm.
and this little article, and they had gone and changed something. So I had I'm like trying to think if I want to use the example directly or not, but
Right.
it's fine because it was Entertainment Weekly,
Hmm.
and the story that I published was just about Spiritual Cinema Club.
Hmm.
And specifically, the person that I had interviewed had said that The Passion of the Christ was
Hmm.
not a spiritual film.
Hmm.
And so it took a little hit at that movie, just in a comical, sort of slight way. And when I saw the article, once it was published, it was changed to
Hmm.
sound as if it includes the passion.
Hmm.
And then
Right.
I flipped maybe three pages forward, and there was this big ad for the movie coming out on VOD
Hmm.
or on a DVD back then. And it
Yeah.
was like, oh, and I
Yeah.
that memory really stayed with me. I didn't have a chance to preview the copy, but I don't know if I always like fight hard enough to get against edits. Sometimes I do just kind of go, okay, I'm kind of done. I mean, not usually on the big things, but on
Yeah.
smaller things, I do. And sometimes there's definitely certain pieces where either I didn't see the edit
Hmm.
or it was such a process that I didn't want to fight every single
Yeah.
thing constantly. And it wasn't like bad things
Yeah.
that were changed, but just not things that I would have said in the way that they were said.
I got fired from it was a hepatitis C magazine of all things, and yes, they do exist because of pharmaceutical ads.
Mm.
And I was fired for saying the following over email: I would like to know who keeps putting errors into my articles.
You didn't hold back, huh?
I did not.
Yeah.
But there's an opening anecdote in one of Malcolm Gladwell's books. I think it's
Mhm.
Outliers, about this horrible plane crash, and it was the pilots were Korean, and I think the air traffic controllers were American. And apparently, there's a culture of great deference to authority in Korean culture, according to the book. And so they were literally going down in a crash, but they couldn't be like, "We need you to, step up everything you've got for us and save us from crashing." It was nothing like that. It was like, may I part? Because they have the transcript from the black box.
Mhm.
If I could just interject something slightly in a moment, if you don't mind. It was that kind of talk. So I think of that whenever I might be intimidated by an editor, of trying to find somewhere in between those two, of standing my ground and saying, no, this is important. And knowing that sometimes there are some editors who will think that I'm too difficult to work with, which is amazing to me because I don't think I'm being difficult. Like, we want the headline to be accurate. If you
Yeah,
say
the
something
headline is
inaccurate, that
where
would be bad. I
the
had an editor
headline
say,
is where I've gotten into some
yeah, yeah,
kerfuffles because I don't like sensationalized headlines, and I
yeah,
also think that I've had stories where the headline was misleading as to what I'm actually saying,
yeah,
and I was basically told, "Well, that's how we get people to read your story."
yeah,
And did I push back enough on that? Probably not. And
yeah,
it's tough because I understand they have something to sell, and I would hope that people read the story. But then at the same time, I know that a lot of people just read the headlines,
yeah,
and so which is really scary. So my story, like there was definitely certain stories where the headline absolutely did not match the
hmm,
contents, which were far more nuanced,
yeah,
and the photos that were picked, all these kinds of things. And you have to wonder like how much can I do? How much should I say no? But I'm getting better.
yeah,
But I don't think I'm quite there yet. That person in me that wants to be a people pleaser,
yeah.
unfortunately, is still a pretty even though people might look at me and be like, she's not a people pleaser, I am.
I am too.
Eh,
I want them to like me.
it's just that I think where I stand up for things, it comes more from a place of like morally, like this is really wrong and this is the right thing to do.
Yeah,
And so that outweighs the people
yeah,
pleasing aspect or the compliant or
yeah.
wanting to fit in. I think that, and that's where I found too when I interviewed people specifically for my book, where we like looked at people who did stand up to for things and kind of paid the price for it. Like they weren't generally like these antagonistic
Mhm,
individuals for the most part.
mhm.
They were really just people who felt like they had no choice but to say
Right.
something because it was just so blatantly wrong and
Yeah.
they couldn't live with themselves.
Yeah.
When it comes to experts, I think that might be really useful for people
Mhm.
to understand. Like, we talked a little bit about it, but also, like, as a journalist, that the reason that certain people get quoted isn't always because they're the most experienced or most knowledgeable. It's like
Translation.
connections, PR, press
Yeah.
agents, big one, right? Because also, if you go to write a story about a topic, especially if you haven't covered it
Mhm.
extensively, you might not know who to go to. And so you're like, okay, you might go to a university and they'll give you their
Mhm.
expert that they're
Mhm.
pushing, or a PR agency might
Mhm.
pitch. So, but like, how do you discern the
Yeah.
ones that really are worth like paying attention to in a world that's
Yeah.
full of noise?
And I have had a few very short deadline articles that I've had to write where quick, write about weed in 5 hours or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
So that always makes me kind of nervous. You don't want to be that guy who picked the real jerk to quote, whatever it might be. So
Yeah.
my general process is you look it up in PubMed, you find the papers, and the emails of the authors are always right there. You can just contact them directly. You can bypass any comms agents at the university. And then if you start looking in the footnotes, you see the other papers. That sounds interesting too. Next thing you know, you're getting full circle. They're all starting to refer to each other. Sometimes that's a problem. It's called circularity or citation laundering,
Mm-hmm.
but that's the whole thing. Let's just trust that they are all just mutually experts in this field. You're like, okay, I'm seeing the same names here. I'm hearing the same things. These are the big people. And so one thing that I'll do is I'll ask each of them about one another and say, is she a good person to cite? And once I was writing an article about grasslands for the New York Times, and there was one of the experts just thought that trees were terrible in general, like was totally against trees as environmental
Wow.
act or something, planting trees. And granted, like, there's, I can't remember the word for it, but with trees, because they're all dark, that can actually absorb more heat and light from the sun rather than reflecting it like on the poles. So if you plant a bunch of trees over like a snowy area, that actually make things worse. But I remember asking people, being like, he seems pretty venerable. He's a distinguished chair of whatever at his university. And they're like, oh, yeah, he's really past his prime. So I'll ask around like that. But
Mm-hmm.
then there's just observing their own discourse, over time. And that's something that, especially when you're really specialized in something, you're spending a lot of time over years observing these people, how they carry themselves on social media and other media outlets, and sometimes you have to wonder, like, when they have their own website, when they have their own dedicated PR agent, they're going to say things that are in service of being in the press, as that might rise in their level of priorities. So, and I almost never use anyone who is pitched to me by a press agent. The other day I said, like, this is unbelievable to me because you actually pitched me something that I need an expert for. But even then, you have to wonder why they're using a press agent, because anybody who's an actual expert in the field, unless it's some obscure thing that really does deserve attention, yet nobody's giving it, then you'll find them because they've written papers and other people respect them. And I'll just say, to whomever, who are other people you recommend? Can you recommend two other papers? And then eventually you get the sense of who the big people are. So it's not really that complicated, but I think for a lot of journalists, they don't get it because they don't. I think they unnecessarily find reading scientific papers intimidating. I don't think it's that
Yeah.
complicated. They're usually written in fairly accessible language, with the exception of, like, a cousin of mine published a paper in Cell, for example. I could not understand one word of it. So, but if you're reading about public health or something like that, just ordinary medical practices, it's probably pretty accessible. And ultimately, just like, if you don't know, ask them. Say that I don't understand this word. I'll go in like, oh, what does that vocabulary word mean? That'll fill in the blanks for me. So, and that
That's
makes it
really
really
good.
interesting. So
Yeah.
it's
And you're
it's a way
learning.
of translating, essentially.
Yeah. For me, what I think I'll praise my communications department that I went for my school,
Mhm.
where I think they did a good job is like their statistic courses were
Mhm.
mandatory for
Nice.
communications majors. So, and I
Mhm.
think that it should, as it should be. They had actually there were like research skills, but there was also two stats course. One was within the communication department. The other one they ended up not making a requirement later on. That one within the math department.
Mhm.
Um, so obviously a bit harder,
Yeah.
but both required math, but were achievable. I got lucky too with that. I had a really great usually the guy who taught it was like just horrible. Like, Rate
Mhm.
My Prof had the worst reviews of him. He took one sabbatical ever.
Mhm.
And that was it when I did it. And I got this really great guy
Yeah.
who like made me really love stats. And but I think it's important and you know, reading papers and understanding, I think that should very much be in the toolkit of journalists
Mhm.
and people too, because stats are, as you know, are always
Yeah.
used to misrepresent truth as well as represented.
Mhm.
I think though, like where we're going is there's just such a distrust of public health.
Yeah.
There is a distrust of like, okay, who can I trust? And a lot of people are, they're not, if you're a lay person, you're not going to spend time like reading journals, you're not going to spend time researching the experts that are being
Yeah.
cited in articles. And so it becomes really difficult for people on very important issues that affect their own health, right? Some,
Mhm.
whether that's, you know, monkeypox or HIV or the pandemic, obviously would have been, you know, was a very big topic that affected pretty much everyone. And you see people who are like, well, on the one hand, you had a situation where I think it, trust was undermined by these institutions because they did misrepresent the truth, or in other words, lied. I have personal examples of that happening even where I am, and
Well, we've seen
and the
those emails that have come out from those groups who were saying like, we're going to go say the exact opposite of what we're saying in private and public, with
yeah,
respect to
see,
COVID.
wow,
I can't remember their names,
and
but you know.
and that's like that trust once is broken that
Yeah.
way, it's impossible to get. Whether it was something like the masking, which was you know, first they're like, well, you don't need the mask, but they actually thought they did,
Mhm.
people did, they just didn't want, instead of being they didn't want them to run out for medical professionals, but instead of just saying that and hopefully trusting the public, you know, there's going to be different kinds of
Mhm.
people. Some, but a lot of people I think would have respected that. But once you lie, that's like you can't be trusted. I had a situation where in Canada. So in the U.S., there were two things that were happening differently. One was because you had more supplies of vaccines,
Mhm.
you get the first dose and then you go get the next one.
Mhm.
In Canada, we ran out of Pfizer, so suddenly they were like, "Well, mix and match. It's
Yeah.
better." And which, by the way, I think there were studies later on that
I
did
think it
show
turned out
that,
to
but
be
at that
true, but
time,
they were just guessing at the time, you
at
know.
the time they were
Yeah.
guessing, and it also was like the U.S. wasn't letting people travel there
Mhm.
if you mixed and matched. So I mean, I
Mhm.
think there was a lot of things that were just misleading.
Mhm.
They had doctors stationed where the vaccines were being administered. Who didn't understand how the vaccines worked. And so there was kind of a lot of BSing going on. I'm like, hey, what's the difference between the Pfizer and the Moderna?
Mhm.
And she couldn't, you know, the person I asked
Mhm.
couldn't even explain, right? And so I think you had a lot of really bad public communication as well as lying.
Mhm.
So now that's all very undermined. And unfortunately means that a lot of people are like, well, we can't trust
Mhm.
everything that they say. Instead
Yeah.
of saying, like, let's be more skeptical, they're like, we can't trust anything.
Yeah.
So how do you like overcome that, I
Yeah.
guess?
For me, with monkeypox in particular, was just remaining steadfast. Essentially, it was doing all the reading, and there wasn't that much to read, so it really didn't take it that much time. You know, it helped that I was just laid up with cancer and had time on my hands,
Mm-hmm.
in that sense. But people saw it, and they saw that I was under a lot of pressure from other gay men who were accusing me of being homophobic, for saying things that were that my read of the science were obviously true. Essentially, that this was being transmitted overwhelmingly by sex between men. It was just that simple. And I remember being very proud of myself because I had very carefully chosen the word overwhelming, and that I'd fought for it in the headline, a piece I did on the NBC, and then it showed up in other media outlets like the next day, and I just quietly took credit for that one.
Mm-hmm.
But
Because it
people
was
just,
accurate.
it was accurate, and the
Yeah.
way that I knew it was accurate was that the NHS in the UK, they had these really great weekly analyses of all the breakdowns of the data that they were getting. And so the charts that showed the percentage of infections that were in men, it was just a straight line. And with a virus transmitting that widely, that quickly, had that quick of a turnover between people, whereas with HIV, it would have been much slower, for example, you could presume that if the dynamics of how we're going to transmit were going to change, you would have seen it within a few weeks. And week after week, it was flat. So I remember telling my therapist, I was like, maybe I'm having self-doubts here. What if my saying, these words like overwhelming, that I'm so certain that this is, also likely going to remain overwhelmingly in gay men? If I'm off base here, I'm like, no, because I've done all the reading. So, and being consistent with that, and being consistent in the place of unbelievable flagellation by some very angry people who had other things in mind. They had their activist goals and their concerns about stigma. And that's something that I really want to write more about, is how fighting stigma at all costs can come at a great cost, essentially. And I've seen that in many contexts.
They've definitely seen an increase of
Yeah.
Stigma or discrimination, actually, because as a counter reaction. And I don't want to excuse that behavior, but
No.
but ultimately these things are tied together.
Mhm.
And so yeah, it's very saddening. Like, even in the whole trans discourse of side of things, like, I just, in the beginning, what I was mostly seeing is a little bit of reasonable pushback, where it's like, okay, we're concerned about kids, we're maybe
Yeah.
concerned about prisons, certain spaces, sports. And then it devolved into, because there was such a strong activist push that was, and what was being seen by people as radical, as opposed to, most people just want to live their lives and be left alone. All that stuff is true. But then there's also the ones that are radical. And what was being amplified, it was the radical viewpoints. So as a counter reaction to that, I started seeing, instead of just kind of people being somewhat polite and having some legitimate concerns, I started seeing people right out, being actually like transphobic and calling people names and demeaning and want to take away certain rights. And so you can't look at those two things in a vacuum.
No.
Even though I'm like, that doesn't justify that behavior, but it does explain it.
Yeah.
So I just think with this coverage too, is like, when you can't talk about issues like, okay, so monkeypox, the people who are most at risk should know that, right? Like, ultimately you're looking, yeah, exactly. And you don't want to spread excessive fear to groups
Right.
that where it's not really going to be such a huge concern.
Yeah.
But on the language, I don't know. There's a term for this, and I can't remember it. But like, it's these words like likely, almost everyone. I
Yeah.
I have a tendency to use those, and I almost like, oh, they're like little disclaimer words. But I feel like if I don't put them in, then I get people being, well, not everyone's like that. Well, I
Yeah.
assume not everyone's like that, but I have a tendency for more accuracy to put those in as well.
I think likely is it's sort of a stand-in for a mathematical equation, the word risk. There's a guy out there who thinks that I'm evil because I insist on using the word risk, which he says can promote stigma, and therefore should never use it. And I said, what word would you recommend for saying that something X is more likely to occur if B? That's a risk equation. You can choose another one, likely, if you like, but we're going to have to
Did he
talk
give
about
you
it.
an answer to that?
No. And also I was
No.
like, do you have any research to back up your claims that the word risk is harmfully stigmatizing? And he had none. So I don't have a lot of patience for that. It just comes down to like virtue signaling, essentially. This euphemism creep, or whatever the term is, there are theories, at least, that the reason you have this turnover in what the latest PC term is for whatever it might be, is so that elites can signal to one another that they're in the elites. And that's, I think, what I was referring to earlier, with people in the public health world are very concerned with being seen by one another as very giving. And so you get a lot of this turnover where I think that the term person who injects drugs is much better than injection drug user, because it says that they are a person first, and this drug use is a part of their life, but is not the core of their being. Whereas there is no actual substantive difference between saying homeless and unhoused. That's just euphemism migration, or whatever you want to call it. And I think it's ridiculous.
It doesn't, it just doesn't make any
You know,
sense to me. But you have a lot of there's a lot of claims that are floating around where people, and I get kind of, I'm probably pretty annoying about it, but I always kind of harp on the fact that you can't say something is if you have no evidence that that's the case.
Mhm.
Now, people can have intuition.
Yeah.
Sometimes that intuition is correct. People can speculate, but you have to be precise with your language when you're making a claim. If you have no proof, you shouldn't be making that claim.
Right.
But we're
Totally.
floating around in an ecosystem where everyone's making claims. There's all these
Mhm.
like influencers, things pass around. There was a really great post the other day where somebody showed how there was a claim that was kind of, well, it wasn't even a claim, it was a speculation, but it wasn't very clear.
Mhm.
So the original tweet, it was just this like speculation about a political situation. It wasn't even a speculation, it was like a fantasy almost. Um, and the person posted it and got a lot of views.
Mhm.
And afterwards kind of replied saying, well, I'm not saying this is what happened,
Mhm.
I'm just guessing. And but I'm sure it did. And then that tweet was then taken by a bigger account,
Mhm.
and they posted it. There's rumors that this is what's been happening. Okay,
Mhm.
so then that spread, and then the next one says blah 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 happened,
Yeah.
and then
Exactly.
the next thing we know, like the White House is commenting on it.
Yep. Exactly. So there are two things that you referred to earlier. I could think I can tie them all in. Where this is
Hmm.
an example of citation laundering, essentially. That what you said is a metaphor for. I'm reading. So David Zweig, if you know him, he was a journalist that wrote a lot, especially for New York Magazine, about school shutdowns and mask mandates and how the science behind them was very poor, et cetera, during the height of the COVID pandemic. So he's got a book that I've got the galleys of called "An Abundance of Caution." That is this book that just is a scathing account of how we got to where we did with school closures in the United States. And so he's describing, how did this idea that it would be a great idea to, send all the kids home for a long period of time come to be? And it shows how there were these sort of task force put together previously. What do we do in the event of a mass flu epidemic? And so they were already basing it on a flu, which, as in the 1918 flu, affected disproportionately young people, whereas the inverse was true with COVID. So no one ultimately thought to correct that. And if you go back far enough in time of one layer over another of like what studies referring to another thing, another task force, it literally boiled down to one of the researchers the child had like a school science fair and they had arbitrarily picked some figure. And so this filtered up until what we're being told by Birx and Fauci, during this big press conference at the White House, or that we all must send our kids home and that we know what we're doing because of science, right? So similarly, the University of York put out all these systematic literature reviews, which are considered the gold standard of scientific evidence, last April, about pediatric gender medicine. And one of the reviews concerned all of the global guidelines that have come out from, be they the National Health Service in Sweden, or the Endocrine Society, the American Academy of Pediatrics, or the World Professional Association of Transgender Health in the United States. And it analyzed their strengths. And it had this unbelievable diagram that Christina Buttons actually wrote a very good Substack about this, if you want to look it up, about showing just this diagram of how WPATH, which is basically these self-declared experts in transgender health, but somebody has to declare experts in a new field. So, how else can you do it but deciding that we all are the experts? It's got to start somewhere, right? So,
Sure.
giving credit that, their guidelines for transgender treatment for kids started in some year, it's like 2013. And then ultimately the Endocrine Society and the AAP refer to it in theirs. And then when the WPATH puts out their new guidelines, 2022, they refer back to the Endocrine Society and to the AAP, but don't mention that the person they were getting that information from was themselves. So this is called circularity or citation laundering, because when you're asking yourself, where does the buck stop? Where is the first paper that proves this point that you now is this received wisdom? Nowhere, because it just goes around in circles. That's how you lose trust, right? So we see
Yeah.
this in all these. You just pointed out this example, sort of in the real world madness of social media, but somebody's got to prove the point. And then you just get people who's, Trump, of course, is probably the most guilty of this in the world, of saying things over and over again until they become true, so to speak. And scientists, we would hope to hold to a higher standard than a person, who got his start being on a game show. So that it's but it's interesting to see the patterns. I'm reading David Zweig books. I'm like, oh, this is just the same playbook that I'm seeing so intimately now in my reporting about pediatric gender medicine. Is if we say these are life-saving treatments enough, no one will ask who actually proved that. Well, no one has. And in fact, despite the fact that they've been saying this for years, all the advocates in GLAAD, et cetera, the first time anyone actually conducted a study to directly assess the association between youth receiving cross-sex hormones for gender distress and a difference in suicide death was published a year ago. It's published last February out of Finland, and they have all this great national data, and they did not find a statistically significant, association between those two things. And so this claim that it's life-saving is based both on presumption and professional experience, which is at the bottom of the evidence pyramid. Systematic literature reviews are on the top. And it's just been said enough times where it just becomes an ingrained truth. And similarly, this idea that all major medical associations in the United States support this. Did anyone ever run an audit of all the major medical associations to see if they actually did? No. And it turns out the American Society for Plastic Surgeons never did. And then when pressed last year, they said that they were going to endorse, that they weren't in a position to do so. And that's not the same thing as saying that they support bans. But even the president, when interviewed by Blair Peters, who's this gender affirmative surgeon from Oregon Health and Science University, Oregon State Health, I can't remember, but the Oregon hospital, he said that he didn't rule out actually supporting bans. That was really interesting to watch. And Blair Peters, who's this major advocate for gender surgeries on TikTok and on Instagram, he said like, oh, well, if there were problems, then us doctors, we'd be the first to course correct. And the president of ASPS, who's a Black man, said, well, need I remind you of Tuskegee and all those doctors who for decades did not course correct when experimenting upon Black men, and not treating them for syphilis. So that was a real needle off the record moment. We're like,
That's
you
very
really think
important.
that doctors can be trusted to self-correct? And Republican lawmakers, the due process argument is not what's made it to the Supreme Court. It's an equal protection claim when it comes to the Supreme Court case over pediatric gender medicine being banned in Tennessee in particular. But the argument that Republican lawmakers and the AGs defending against the lawsuits against their bans of these treatments is that these doctors cannot be trusted to self-regulate. And that is why the Republicans have come into ban, because in this case, we don't think that you can be trusted in that regard. So, it's a matter of law in that regard of what will turn out to be the truth based on judges' decisions.
It's really interesting. And I think it's also, comes to when you do repeat something many times, which is the broader issue as well, is that, so even just the way that our brain reacts, I forget what it's called, the phenomenon of that, but basically, the first time you encounter new information, you're like more critical of it.
Mhm.
And then the following times it just becomes familiar. So your brain processes it a different way. So whether that's like the repeated sort of taglines of, this is safe and effective or whatever, which I'm not even saying in as an opinion here, but any kind of slogan that affects or any bit of information, and people don't tend to look at it further, especially the more they hear it, because it's like known, but it's not necessarily known. As you pointed out, we don't even know where some of this stuff comes from, or it comes from something that's just has no real evidence or basis to it. Which kind of brings us to just in general, like I'd love to get your thoughts on misinformation, disinformation in the science and health realm. How do you deal with it in the most constructive way, particularly, in terms of ensuring that people do have the correct information, because it is life and death in many cases, or certainly a risk if they go off of the wrong things.
I mean, I have to be humble. I remember somebody saying to me that this article I was publishing in the New York Times was going to change all of the aquaculture economy. I was writing about squid. the Ghost of Chile. And I said, let's just hope that like some people read it, you know? So I'm not going to pretend that I'm going to solve the misinformation crisis, but it's about consistency, repeating things over and over and over again. And I said this to one editor who kind of flinched. And I said to him that like, basically every single time that you publish an article about pediatric gender medicine, you have to say a number of things over and over and over again, that there is dispute globally, that 5 nations in Europe have pulled back dramatically as a reaction to systematic literature reviews, finding that this evidence is very weak and inconclusive, that they have reclassified these drugs as experimental. And so when you hear that way, when you hear a slogan that all experts agree in the United States, and you'll say, okay, well, let's break that down. First of all, they don't agree internationally. Secondly, what do you mean by all the different medical associations agree? What that means is that basically a small committee, one person at the American Academy of Pediatrics wrote their policy statement about the gender affirming care method in 2018. Dr. Jason Rafferty, he was at the time a medical resident. They edited that policy statement with a small committee and ultimately published it and said that he was solely responsible for the contents. And so that has in turn inspired the other medical associations. Do you think that they conducted systematic literature reviews or even like ran it through a major committee? No, they basically just looked to see what the AAP and the Endocrine Society did. Also, similarly, a small group of people at the Endocrine Society who are all themselves, quote unquote, experts in this, but also who have a vested interest in this medical field doing well. I mean, the worst example of that, in my opinion, is spinal surgery. They're very well-paid surgeries. People can just crank them out. And in many cases, things like discectomies, that there's the rate at which people recover or don't is the same between having that surgery or having a sham surgery. So you have to ask yourself also when these experts criticize systematic literature reviews for being run by non-experts, or the CAS review out of England, which is this 4-year-long process by which this venerable pediatrician analyzed this entire field of medicine, was conducted by somebody who had no experience in this field. So it's easy on its face to criticize her. Why would you want somebody who's not themselves directly experienced? Well, we'll tell you, because that way you don't have an intellectual conflict of interest. And that's something that I think the general public doesn't know enough about, we all know about financial conflicts of interest. If you're, say, you're a politician and if you got something to do with you're passing a law that's going to impact a company in which you own stock, that's a problem. Similarly, if you're promoting this medical field as being based on sound evidence, and that's where you get your paycheck, but also it's where you get your credibility, and that's what you've worked your entire career for, and the perch on which you stand, you have, that's called an intellectual conflict of interest. So we need to be more savvy consumers. I remember when I was in the 6th grade, they gave us this assignment where we were supposed to read this one-page description of this very bizarre culture called the Nasarima. And they did very odd things. In the morning, they stood before a shrine and they did these weird things to their bodies and all this stuff. And we were asked to write about what a bizarre group of people these were. And then the teachers sort of lift the curtain and said, the Nasarima is just America spelled backwards. And you can look at this up. It's sort of a famous little lesson that they give to kids, I think, to this day. And what we've done is we've used loaded language to describe everyday things that you all do in the morning. The shrine was just like a mirror above the sink and people brushing their teeth. So that was a really great lesson. And there's a guy named Sander van der Linden. It was somewhat controversial, but he's an expert in misinformation, which of course begs the question of like, how do you become an expert in that? And what if you yourself are furthering misinformation? Which, and I like him. I've interviewed him and worked with him in the past, but I know people are very critical of him. But he's written a lot and studied a lot about this kind of vaccination against misinformation. And one of the exercises that I'll have like kids in school do is he'll show how misinformation is created. And so if you understand how the sausage is made, in theory, at least from his research, you're more likely to withstand, because it makes you misinformation in the future, because it makes you a more savvy consumer, because you realize, oh, I could do this to other people if I wanted, and it also can be done to me. And, slogans are a big part of that. But one thing I wanted to say, I think you brought up earlier, was just this idea of we don't know. And that's a very hard term for people to wrap their heads around. Well, shouldn't you know? And we don't know is the basis of all science, and we want to know. And I remember I was listening to poor Jesse Singal called into the Majority Report, that ultra lefty
Mm.
podcast, and there's a Sam Seder and Emma Vigeland. And boy, do they have their mind made up about pediatric gender medicine, and they should know too because they have a podcast. So they wouldn't bring them
Anyone
on.
with a podcast or enough followers, that's the
Knows everything.
experts.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
direct
they know
correlation.
everything.
We all know that.
Yeah,
So
no, and that's the expectation now, right?
yeah,
Is like,
so
well, you must know everything and have an
right.
opinion and everything. It's like how?
I know some. I
How
know
would you
about
have
some
enough
things.
hours in a day to
Yeah,
know everything and to
yeah,
research it all in a way where you're like, hey, I'm putting out a
yeah.
responsible, well-informed opinion out there. It's just crazy to me that people think,
I was just arguing with, well, debating David Zweig's book with a certain New York Times columnist who I sort of DM with some. And this, I was like, well, I disagree with that time you wrote this thing, and the person's like, oh yeah, well I have all these reams of data, and all I could say was like, you've researched this a lot more than I have, so I'm not sure. So, but that was just my thought. But like,
and that's an important
disagree.
thing to
I'm not
do.
sure,
I mean,
but
there's like so many topics where I'm like,
not an
listen,
expert here. Nope.
yeah, I have very tiny little
Yeah,
opinions that I don't actually verbalize, and only
yeah.
because I'm like, I really don't know. I don't know enough. I don't
That's
think I should
a sign
be
of a great
talking about it.
intellectual, in my opinion. But
I
Jesse,
hope.
they wouldn't even bring him on the show on Majority Report. This was September of 2 years ago, and instead he had to call in. It was already, and because they really had the mic and they could shout over him, that the sound was very poor, so they already had the upper hand just because of that. And at one point, Emma's screaming at him like, are these treatments safe and effective? The question was something like that, and Jesse goes, oh, well, we don't know. And I was floored because I hadn't ever really
Yeah.
been able to conceive that. To that point, I've been studying this for about 9 or 10 months. I was like, oh, we don't know. Emma and Sam lost their minds. They screamed and yelled, how could you do it?
Oh, because he's fostering vaccine hesitancy by saying that. I think that's
Yeah.
where it kind of comes
This is
from, the
about gender
aggressiveness of
medicine.
that.
I said,
Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
yeah.
Yeah, wrong
But
thing.
they were so certain, and when he, an actual expert in this subject, said that not only does he not know, but in general the academy doesn't know, much to the contrary of what's been claimed left and right by activists and all these different doctors in this field, they lost their minds, because why would a journalist know more than the expert? And that is a very good question, a very fair one, but sometimes they do. So it's difficult because it demands us that we all, of course, this term has been so bastardized, do our own research, and that's
Mm.
exhausting. And similarly with your everyday pediatrician, there was this period where I worked on an article that was ultimately killed by the publication, where basically I just wanted to know, what's it like for pediatricians to work with these kids who have gender dysphoria? They're the front lines. They're often the first point of contact for medicalizing these kids. They send them on to the gender clinics. So what's it been like for them in this time of great change? And although I had a very biased sample, because it was sort of a snowball sample where, a couple skeptics, doctors, were referring to me to all their other skeptic friends. So this was not exactly, an unbiased sample of all doctors everywhere, but there was sort of your everyday doctors who didn't think about this very much, and then there was the skeptics. The
Mhm.
skeptics had one thing in common: they'd all done the reading, and then the second thing they all had in common, they all had a reason. They told me why they had time to do the reading, like they didn't have kids anymore, or they were single during the pandemic and they were lonely, and so they read about it all the time. Whereas all the other doctors all pretty much said the same things. Well, I trust the gender clinics; they're experts. I trust the AAP; they're the experts. They've looked into this for me, and that's what these medical societies and their guidelines are for. Because nobody has time, nor should they have to do all the reading. That's what you get a textbook for. So, but sometimes the system can break down that order of trust, and it can be really damaging to have then us lose trust in other domains where we should be able to trust the experts.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that happens sometimes with people is that also they choose not to read, not necessarily just because they don't have time, but also because it they know that they might find something that contradicts.
Hmm.
And that's like a dangerous thing, right? Because
Yeah,
it changes. If I think this thing that all my friends think, it's much
really lonely.
easier for
Yeah.
me. Yeah. If I find out that this is wrong, like, okay,
Hmm.
now I have the responsibility to say something, and that is a
Hmm.
risk. That is, my
Yeah.
friends might not like me very much anymore. And in professional circles, that could make you a pariah.
Hmm.
So I think that is an incentive for people not to
Yeah.
even like do their own research. So doing
Yeah.
your own research, I think, is also unfortunately a lot of the do your own research crowd. To them, it's like reading like a
I
couple
don't know
biased
how.
things and some tweets or whatever,
Yeah.
and
They're not going to
and listening to.
PubMed.
No, they're not.
Well, also
And
there's a some cost with that for some people. If you're a parent, who has given consent to your child to have gender transition
yeah,
drugs, or if you're an expert who's based their entire career on something, if so I've written a novel, which is in a drawer, of course, like most people's novels. But I was listening to I can't remember her last name, but it's a
just to
yeah.
clarify, most people's novels are not
Mhm.
in drawers. They're
They
in
don't
their heads
exist. There you go.
thinking that we're going to write it. So at
Fair
least
enough.
you wrote it. So I want to give
Exactly.
you all that
I
credit.
never people would say that to me, and I'm like, yeah, it doesn't make me feel any better, because I spent like 14 years on it. But there's a podcast out there called the Memory Wars, I believe, which is about the repressed memory movement in the 80s and 90s and how damaging it was.
Mm.
And I was listening to it, I'm like, because there are a lot of parallels in theory to the pediatric gender movement, and in theory, the sort of quote unquote, well, at least the bulge of gender dysphoria and trans identification will pass in time, and young natal females will, fall into some other ism to as a way of processing their problems. This is all in theory, mind you, but there was so much criticism of this idea of repressed memories, coming to the fore, and then it all makes sense in the end. This has been used in so many movies, and like it was always bullshit. Like that's not at all how the memory works. We don't very commonly have these totally inaccessible memories that have been locked in by trauma. And it just so happens that that was the climax of my novel. And,
Hmm.
I thought I was so clever, I had based it in part, on reading the book Sybil. And so then I felt like a real heel. And I was like, oh, I thought I could sort of change it in a way. But I told the author of the podcast, Jenna, about this. She actually had me on to record for her sequel, because it would have been so against my better principles to espouse the credibility of this debunked psychological concept just because it made for a good plot line. But I thought that would be interesting to sort of change it such that one character sort of brings it up and presumes the other person has repressed it this whole time. And then they say, no, who do you think I am? Of course I've known all this time. Like I was there.
Mm.
And then you as a reader realize that you were expecting that they had done that. It's just that you did not have access to the very depths of their unconscious. So at least that was safe face, and I wouldn't have to change more than a few pages. So,
That could work. I had a similar thing yesterday. If it makes you feel better, I
yeah.
published something, and somebody sent me a note saying that the theory that I was alluding to has been pretty much, kind
Mhm.
of didn't stand the test
Yeah.
and replication test. And it's like, it's embarrassing, but what I
Mhm.
did is I'm putting a note that I've been corrected. I put a
Right.
note on the story, and but that takes a lot of because certainly a lot of time one might want to ignore that.
Yeah.
You have to be very conscious of making sure that you don't fall into that trap.
Yeah.
And I'm sure I have at
Well,
times.
I mean, it's also just writing always with the option that new research will come in and make us understand something differently. If people can conduct fantastic, high quality research of pediatric gender medicine, it shows that it's the greatest thing ever. And here's how you do it exactly with this group of kids, and here's how you assess them. Then I would be totally on board with that. And it's not also not my place to endorse medical practices of any kind, but I have never written anything that would make me look bad where later new research showed a lot of certainty where before there was uncertainty, because what I was writing about
Mm.
was the uncertainty as opposed to what people think that I'm writing about, which is being opposed to it. So
Yeah. Well, I'm curious
mm,
if you'd
mm,
agree with me with this assessment
mm,
that a good journalist
mm.
must be a professional, curious person,
Oh yeah.
essentially.
Yeah, and that's hopefully why you go into it. And there's the element of, this sort of a showman type career, you get attention. And so, I was an actor as a kid, so I have to be
Ah,
constantly aware of that element of myself and say, why do you really want to write this thing? Is it because it's in something prestigious, or you're actually interested in what you're doing and you're hoping that you will have some sort of impact? But that's, an insatiable neurosis, that desire for attention. Whereas, being interested and engaged in a subject and being passionate about it, liking learning, those are things that will actually cause you to feel satisfaction in the long run. So, and
Love it.
that's where I am at, in the odd event that things slow down and I don't have anything to do. I really ask myself, like, what would you find most interesting, and where is that a cross section of like what needs the most attention? Where do you think you can make the most difference in people's understanding of some topic? And so that has endlessly been pediatric gender medicine, but it's been an eye-opening transition. Something you were saying earlier about people's biases is I can take people very seriously if their criticism of providing these drugs to kids, if they're concerned about the evidence base, they're concerned about harms and trade-offs and that sort of thing. But when you change the channel a little and suddenly we're talking about adults and you refuse to use their preferred pronouns, and you have this sort of pretext of feminism that I find to be rather thin, and it start to hear a lot of words out of your mouth that really make it seem like you're just a bigot, and this is concerning to me. Whereas before I respected this person more, that they seemed to have a very solid intellectual reason, and now it just seems like biases, and they don't like people who are different. And there's a question of what's it to you if somebody's transgender, like, and some of these people would say that it really does bother them, period, regardless of whether it's a matter of them being in a single sex space. And that's when you really lose me. So, and that's how I've been kind of pushing back. And the reason I published the thing the other day in my Substack about why I use preferred pronouns is one thing I get hounded upon it so much. I want to have an answer. Just read this and go away. That's my policy. But it was a way of pushing back and saying, like, you people think that like I'm your puppet or like right-wing puppet or something, and you are sorely mistaken. And so I'm going to write something that I know is going to make you mad, and hopefully some of you will leave. So, and hopefully I'm not so captured that I don't mind. And indeed, since I wrote that, I'll get churn in my number of followers, my Substacks, but like it's been sort of flatlined since Friday, whereas usually it's going up a little bit each day. So, and I said beforehand, like, that I was okay with that I wanted to. So, and it's fun to
I can relate to that for sure, because I think some of my following I gained. I used to just do straight reporting. I definitely didn't express my opinion on anything. And then when I started doing that, I was pushing back on a lot because I felt that was part of my responsibility as a human being.
Yeah.
I started pushing back on ideas that I thought were radical on the left, and so as a result, I the people who follow me, my subscribers and my followers in social media, it's a combination of people. Like, there's definitely kind of across aisles, but definitely also a lot of people on the right. And I think often what happens to people is that they'll just play to that audience for various reasons, attention, money, but also honestly, it's like getting the mean comments is like, it's not that easy. And once I started seeing things on the right where I was like, this is not aligned with my principles, and those were like literally the exact same types of things I was criticizing the left for. I'm just seeing them on the right also. I started getting all these like really mean spirited attacks, and sometimes you just want to be like, oh, I don't want to go through that. But at the same time, I think it's so important to stay consistent to your own like values and principles. So I wasn't like upset with what the left was doing because they're on the left. What I didn't like are they weren't upholding principles that I value. So things like tolerance or being evidence-based or personal liberties. And so I'm seeing that here. I'm going to, elsewhere, I'm going to point it out.
Yeah.
But I think people sometimes see that as this betrayal and get very emotional about it and very hostile.
They weren't listening.
No, I mean, because ultimately I haven't changed at all.
Yeah.
I haven't changed my positions. I'm just like pointing them out when they're happening on their end. And it's like, and it's funny because I'd write these things that are, I try to be more general, right? So I won't say, oh, the left this or the right this usually. So I'll talk about in generalities about how we, assess the world or our biases and things like that. And people will like agree. They're like, totally. And they're like, the Democrats always do this. The Democrats are, and I'm like, you're not listening, because I am saying this is human nature.
Human nature, exactly.
And we are all doing this.
Yeah.
I'm doing this even, like I'm pointing this out, but I'm doing this too.
Yeah.
And only through being aware that we're doing this and also understanding what our values are can we like,
Yeah.
make sure that we don't do these things. So,
I
yeah.
remember, what I was going to say is just this sort of psychological phenomenon where they'll just put people in a room and give them a topic, and they'll not have really strong opinions about it at first, but if they keep discussing it, like they'll start to form into camps, and then like the longer they talk about it, the more polarized they'll become, and that's just a natural phenomenon. And what we're seeing from either side of like the gender medicine debate is people pushing on each other really strongly, as you're saying, and they're the people from the polarities. That has only radicalized people and made people move in the opposite direction. But the left and the middle are the people who aren't vocal minorities, but who I think they are more inclined to be alienated by the trans activists, by the right. And you see in the polling, they don't necessarily say, yeah, we think we should ban all this, but they support the various positions and like of Trump right now when it comes to schools and gender medicine, that kind of thing. So.